Hello and welcome to another edition of Partnering for Success. We're so glad to see all of you again. I'm Mandy Zatinsky, Director of Communications, and joining me is Jeremy Anderson, President of Education Commission of the States. We are your MCs for today's discussion on addressing shortages across, keyword across, the teaching pipeline. We'll hear more on that in a moment, but I have a quick question for all of you joining us today. How many of you were here in April for our Partnering for Success session on teacher apprenticeships and their role in supporting and developing the teacher workforce? Just drop a yes or a Y in the chat box, an N or a no, if you were here or not with us in April when we were talking about teacher apprenticeships. We featured Penny Schwinn, Commissioner of Education in Tennessee, and also Karen DeMoss of Prepared to Teach for that discussion.
Well, I'm glad to see so many people who are joining us here today, but I'm also not surprised about how many are with us today and how many of you were also with us back in April. We know that shortages in the teacher workforce are top of mind for many of you in many states. It's why we've dedicated so much of our staff energy to this in recent months.
Exactly. Jeremy, I'm going to drop a link in the chat now with our most recent policy report on this topic. And for those of you in the audience today, we'll also make sure it's in the email that you receive from us tomorrow.
Thanks, Mandy. While there is not necessarily a widespread teacher shortage, we do know that states are facing specific and persistent shortages in certain subjects and in specific schools and communities. We also know that recruitment is important, but teacher attrition is also a very significant driver of the shortages. With that in mind, we are focused on elevating long-term solutions that will support a talent pipeline along the continuum of educators, careers, and helping them look for big opportunities for policy changes rather than just quick fixes that might fill temporary vacancies. That's why we're really pleased to collaborate with Teachers of Tomorrow.
Yes, a very big thank you to Teachers of Tomorrow. They are several partners we work with to bring you content like today's webinar. You see all of our partners on our screen now. We thank Teachers of Tomorrow and all of our partners for their continued support. Before we get into today's lineup, I want to make mention of the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I know that we are all Zoom pros at this point, but I also know that this is a very inquisitive group. So to help us keep questions separate from the chat, please be sure to drop your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen versus the chat box. We do have open time at the end of today's discussion for public Q&A, so we'll ask those questions then.
Thanks a lot, Mandy. It's really my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. And Secretary Arne Duncan is going to be joining us in just a little bit. He's having some technical difficulties right now, but I'm really excited to have two amazing chiefs from two states who are trying to tackle this issue in very diverse ways. Today with us, we have Katie Jenner, who is Secretary of Education in Indiana, and we have Joan Ebert, who is Superintendent of Public Instruction in Nevada. So I really want to start out, and I know Arne will be joining us soon here. I want to start out by just asking both of you, from your state perspective, teacher shortages have garnered a lot of attention recently and even in the past year. Can you maybe introduce yourself and give us a brief picture of what you're seeing in your state and what is new and challenging now and what is maybe not so new? And maybe we could start with you, Secretary Jenner.
Sure, I'd be glad to start. Jeremy, thank you for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to also join my colleague from across the country, Joan Ebert. I should say colleague and friend from Nevada. It's great to be on today. So my path very quickly. I had the opportunity to teach for a few years. I was a CTE teacher, and then a school administrator, district administrator, served at our statewide community college system called Ivy Tech Community College, as the vice president of K-12 partnerships, which was totally focused on some of the blurring of the lines and the linkages that we'll talk about today. And then prior to the Secretary of Education role, I served as Governor Holcomb's policy director. Again, while my path seemed somewhat linear, it really had a lot of twists and turns along the way. But this is such an important topic for Indiana and for our entire country. A little context: in Indiana, we have more than 63,000 teachers at over 2,200 schools, serving about 1.12 million children. And we know that when it comes to a school, having a quality teacher in the classroom is the greatest asset, the foundational asset that we always must start with. So now I'm going to get into some of the challenging news. We as of last week, we had, not to be exact, but I will be, 1,906 teaching vacancies posted on our statewide system, which has about 100% participation from all school types across our state. 451 of those were in special education specifically. And then to zoom out a bit more, when we look at Indiana's data, and we've done so in a real longitudinal fashion. So what I'll talk about is over the past decade. It's interesting because over the past decade, we've actually seen a decrease in our public school students, especially in recent years, and we've seen an increase in the number of teachers we have serving our students. But then when we get into what I like to call the squeeze that we're in, we're seeing, hello, Secretary Duncan. Sorry, you I'm glad to meet you officially.
Keep rolling. I'm sorry.
I'll keep rolling. So when we look at the squeeze that we're in, it's pretty interesting. While we have a slight upward trend in teachers exiting, we're not seeing a mass exodus. Knock on wood. We don't need a mass exodus. So a slight number exiting the profession, but we see a downward trend of teachers entering the profession. And one more quick data piece, and then I'll pass it to my colleague in Nevada, Joan. The decrease in teachers entering in Indiana, we worked with REL Midwest to do a longitudinal study, and we found that just 41% of the students who started in an education program actually completed it. And then only 1 in 6 of the students who started an education program actually made it to an Indiana classroom. And so when we could break that down by our students of color, and which is further fascinating to consider, but also this study showed us a level of opportunity that we have as we think about recruiting. And a couple data points that I'll mention. One thing we saw is students who enter an education program earlier are more likely to complete a 4-year program. We also saw that transferring from a 2-year to 4-year raised the probability for the student to earn their credential, their education credential. And then finally, we have a scholarship for some of our at-risk students in Indiana in the K-12 system that allows them to propel into higher ed, and we pay for a lot of that higher education, called 21st Century Scholars. Those students were much more likely to complete a bachelor's degree in education than non-scholar students. Additionally, of course, we've looked at alternative pathways, et cetera, but so much opportunity in this space, no doubt.
Well, thank you so much, Secretary Jenner. It's great to get your insights on what's happening in Indiana. And I'll turn it over to Superintendent Ebert in Nevada to give us her perspective from her state. And after that, I'll turn it over to former U.S. Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, our moderator. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to the whole ECS team and all of the 252 participants this morning. I know you're all busy, and we value your time, and I'm thankful that you're here to join us in this discussion. For myself, state superintendent, almost 3.5 years. I am not elected to this position, but it's a hybrid position. So first you go to the State Board of Education if you're interested in serving in this role. From the State Board of Education, there are 3 people that move forward to the governor. So eventually this position is appointed by the governor, and I am blessed and honored to serve as part of the governor's cabinet. So that's a little bit about the position. Myself, I started in a middle school classroom. I still have all of that DNA in my skin, and am excited. We had school begin 2 days ago in our 5th largest school district. I was out there 5:30 in the morning with the buses rolling. And so with that, moved on into the classrooms and talked with teachers, talked with principals, to exactly the point of what we're talking about today. In our 5th largest district and across the state, there is about 92% of the classrooms that have a fully licensed educator with our students. And so that other 8% that's out there, we want to make sure that we close that gap and have a highly effective educator in that classroom each and every day moving forward. As far as Nevada goes, the crisis, if you will, is not new as far as always recruiting. When I was a classroom teacher and I'd go to conferences, I'd say, come to Nevada. And you're like, wait, that was a long time ago. And what happened is we grew. When I started in the Clark County School District, there were 120,000 students. When I left 7 years ago, there were over 300,000 students. And one year we opened 17 schools. So the recruitment part, and that's just in one county. Our rural counties have also grown, as well as in the Reno area. And so we continue to grow as a state and move. And hopefully, Katie, when you were talking about the 1 in 6, I'm like, I need to check my data to see if we're being successful in grabbing those graduates to move out west to join our team out here. So as we think about, local here in Nevada, we continue to recruit not only across the United States, but nationally and internationally. We've been recruiting from multiple countries for decades. One of the things that we continue to hope is that as we expand the workforce and recruiting those that have lived in other countries that want to join us, J-1 visas, is something that, with the federal delegation, we want to be able to expand. We do it in other fields in our nation. When we have crisis, we have a crisis here in the United States in making sure that we have highly effective educators with all of our students. And so as we look at the numbers, retaining teachers, as you put out the report, teacher retention, we have a lot that are retiring, rightly so. They have provided support to our kiddos for 30+ years and they retired. But we also see early on in the career that people are changing professions. What I think most of all, and we'll be sharing later on different aspects about how we've been approaching that, but first and foremost is retaining those that we have. Learning from industry, we know that our children, our students are not apt to, when they graduate, to stay in a job for the 30 years that, for me, my chosen profession, that they are going to move on. They're going to have 6, 7, 8 jobs in their life. And so building out an education system that allows students to come in, or now adults, young people, to come into the profession. If they move on to another profession for a while, great. They gain experiences. They have things and talent and skills and passion that they want to bring back. We need to make sure that we create a pathway and open arms for everyone to become an educator as we move forward. So that's the introduction. I look forward to the conversation. And former secretary, it's great to have you on the screen as well.
And sorry for being late and the technical difficulties. I'll jump in with a couple questions, and Jeremy, I'll turn it to you at the end of the conversation to open up to our audience. And just want to thank both of you for your leadership, anytime, but particularly these have been extraordinarily difficult times. And thanks to both you and your teams, your staffs, everyone in the States who continue to stay with us. Just a couple more questions. I really want to sort of dig in and understand this better. So, Katie, you talked about, I think, 1,906 vacancies, call it 2,000 vacancies. I'm really trying to sort of quantify this for myself. What is that compared to last year at this time? And did you have any sense for those numbers? How much different is this summer than last summer?
That's a great question, Arnie. And we heard Joan say that she's been in her role about 3.5 years. Our team started January 2021. And one of the first things that we saw is that we had to improve our educator pipeline data system, because we were, I think, like many states, using significant lag data to make decisions for today. So we launched an educator supply and demand marketplace to better understand what is the demand in real time. That launched March 2022. And then what is the supply, meaning what is the teacher preparation program, training programs, who's in that queue, how do we make sure they connect? So that was actually, that supply piece will be launched in the fall. So Arnie, to answer, or Secretary Duncan, I should be more formal.
Arnie.
You can call me Katie. But Arnie, you ask a really important question, and we've had to lean in and build that data out.
Got it. And I'll go to Joan, because you said something that is just so important. I think we talk about it, we've got to figure out what we do about it, is that we have an education model and lane and step increases based upon traditionally a female workforce that stayed working for 25, 30, 35, 40 years. As you said, that's not going to happen. And so how do we reimagine, just sort of step back? And we got a crisis, we'll talk about the crisis, but step back. If we're trying to not just go back to quote unquote normal, but do something much better, how do we reimagine the pipeline, compensation, training, all those pieces, knowing that if you're lucky, you'll get 6, 8, 10 years from a professional, and you can't sort of back end everything for 30, 35 years out, because that's not going to happen. So easier said than done, but how are you thinking about trying to reimagine this to attract and retain the best and brightest for as long as you can, knowing it may not be forever?
Right. So, I mean, you hit the nail on the head with compensation. And then also, too, just entry into the profession. We have a COPS, which is our Commission on Professional Standards, right, that have set and used historically a set of baseline entry points into the profession. And so we are reimagining those entry points. And, to begin with, the entry points of people that are already within a school building. We have paraprofessionals that want to become educators that also need to work currently in their jobs, right? Earn a paycheck, have a health insurance, all of those pieces, but yet they want to become an educator. And so it is breaking down all those current structures and policies and reinventing them. So we have a program that is allowing our paraprofessionals through legislation, so through policy now, where they can do all of the components of becoming an educator that we expect them to, demonstrating competencies, right? Not just talking about how much time they sit in a seat and what coursework they're taking, but the competencies while they are in the school system, earning a paycheck, have those values. So that is one piece that I would share with this team on reimagining what the entry point into the profession is. And then also, too, I know our school district leaders have been working very hard in restructuring how those steps and lanes entering into the profession and valuing what people bring to the table that is outside of what we have had for hundreds of years into the profession.
Just a quick follow-up question, because what you said was interesting. People may flow out of the profession, but they may want to come back at some point. There's a calling, they go do something else for personal reasons, professional reasons, and sometimes there are barriers to entry to re-entering teaching. So how are you thinking about reducing that friction. So folks that may have taught, left for 5, 10, 15 years, want to come back, how do you make it easier for them to come back into your schools?
So it starts first with the day that they decide that they want to leave the profession, right? It starts right that moment when, for whatever reason, family move, whatever, they decide they want to go explore another profession. That moment, capturing what that we are welcoming them back to the profession, that when they're ready to come back, the doors are wide open. So that moment in time starts the second that they think they want to do something else. Hopefully we retain them to begin with. That is what we need to do, is to retain the teachers, but also knowing the mindset and the new worlds that we live in. And then two, again, making sure that our school districts, as we're working with them, that they also know that we have broken down barriers at the state level for licensure and entry into the profession.
Arne, can I piggyback off of something that Joan mentioned? Obviously, teacher compensation, yes to that, but she also mentioned, re-envisioning the pipeline. And re-envisioning the pipeline, knowing we should really be doing a better job recruiting in current high school students in a rethinking manner there. And we also should acknowledge, back to the important point Joan made about individuals having multiple careers throughout their life. We have people in industry now who are also being called to join our profession. And how might we help them gain a teacher license and credential in order to bring that industry experience in? And we've sought to put a few different initiatives in place to help with that. I'm glad to elaborate when appropriate.
Well, I would like to continue. That's important. We all have a million anecdotes, but I remember one anecdote I heard was a physics leader in industry in physics who had done really well in his career, wanted to come teach, could not handle the licensure process, couldn't get in. So he actually went and taught at Princeton University. And while I'm sure he benefited the students at Princeton University, that was a tremendous loss for where he actually wanted to go, was to go into the public schools at his state. So Katie, let's actually dig in now. And none of us like crises, but there's a true saying that in every crisis there's an opportunity. There is a chance to recreate, reinvent how this works. So talk to me again very specifically. How do you think about trying to better recruit and encourage young people as early as high school to think about the teaching profession? And how do you try and build a relationship there? And then again, how do you reduce that friction for folks that have been in industry, may know the STEM areas very well, where we often have shortages, want to come help out, but historically would basically lock them out of our schools. So talk about both that early piece of high school and folks potentially leaving industry.
Absolutely. So a huge nod to Penny Schwinn from Tennessee, who evidently was here with this team in April. She is another colleague and friend to Joan and I, and she spoke on the teacher apprenticeship. We have some similar models really blossoming in Indiana, and I'll mention one. It's, again, part of this also impacts how we might rethink high school. If 11th and 12th grade of a high school student's journey could be really focused on ensuring they have access to credentials of value. Let's say in this case, they want to be a teacher. Then we have some partnerships blooming where that 11th and 12th grade year, they'd earn a short-term credential. In Indiana, we call that a technical certificate. So that first year, and then they could immediately transfer in to potentially a public or private university. One that I'll spotlight in particular, which is really focused on recruiting a more diverse educator population in Indiana, is one through Ivy Tech Community College, which is, again, our statewide community college, which is public, and a private university right in Indianapolis, Marion University. They set up a public-private partnership, targeted 5 of our largest urban communities, totally to build that grow your own pathway. Couple others I'll mention, and shifting to the adult space and attracting people in. Arne, you mentioned the physics example. STEM, I mentioned earlier, special education is a need. STEM is absolutely a need as well. In Indiana, we have a STEM teacher recruitment fund that has placed hundreds of teachers in classrooms. Many of these teachers could even come, they were in industry and they come in. So the number one focus is, again, teacher placement in STEM. Number two, that the teacher can teach STEM dual credits. Back to that rethinking high school, we need to increase that. And thirdly, that they have that wraparound support, that general PD and STEM. We've also heard examples like that, and one comes to mind. A rural Southern Indiana school superintendent called and said, hey, I have this economist who served one of our local primary industries, businesses, who called, and he's ready to retire, but he doesn't really want to. And he wants to come and teach economics at our high school. I can't get that to happen, right? And we worked with him, and through some alternative licensure pathways, we're able to make sure that he can actually work in our schools, serve our students, and that school superintendent then and principal then take it upon themselves to make sure the teacher has mentorship and other teachers to work with. But that's a common challenge, but yet opportunity that we have to lean into as a country, for sure. A couple others I'll mention. We have a teacher residency grant pilot program. The design is what we sometimes hear: people who want to get their education degree also need to be working simultaneously. And so it allows for funding. The teacher gets paid while they are mentored by an active quality teacher during their student teaching experience, so that, again, they don't have to stop in the workforce, they can continue. And then another one I'll mention, again, targets Black and Hispanic individuals to join the teaching, join us in teaching in our classrooms, and that's the William A. Crawford Minority Scholarship. You can find more on that on all of these on Indiana's website. I don't want to take up all of Joan's time, so I'm trying to speed through, Joan, out of respect for you, but a lot of opportunities that we have to really re-envision our pipeline.
Got it. Question for both of you, hard question. I'll start with Joan. I'm always trying to figure out focus. So different parts of the pipeline, if you could only solve one problem, the recruitment problem or the retention problem, which one is more important for your profession, for your students? If you could only do recruitment, or you could only better, or you could only do retention better, Joan, which one would you pick and why? And then same question for you, Kate.
Great question, because context matters, right? Nevada is much different context than my colleague, amazing colleague, Katie. So for Nevada right now, I would pick retention. And that is something that, based on the data that we have within our state, for the last 5 years, retaining our educators is where we need to put our focus. So I do have a whole piece on recruitment and pipeline and all of those components going within our state. But if you're going to force choice me, I would definitely say retention.
And let's dig in there. Give me the 1 or 2 reasons why you're losing folks, why it's hard to retain them, and what would be your 1 or 2 strategies to better support and retain them.
So, first and foremost, to solve this problem, we need to ask those that are in the profession and why they're leaving their profession, right? So we put together, the legislature in the 2019 legislative session, put together the Teacher Recruitment and Advisory Task Force. And what was wonderful about that group is they are representative of every single school district in our state. Now, for those of you that are not familiar, we have very large land mass here in Nevada and very large school district land mass. So most of our school districts cover 10,000 square miles-ish. So they're very large, and we have 17 school districts. So those teachers selected, they were appointed to the Retention Recruitment Task Force. They were selected selected a chair and a vice chair. We brought them in all together to talk about these issues. What is it that policy-wise we can change? What needs to happen? First and foremost is they put together a report, which I can drop into the chat as well. But to make sure that we have the pay, number one, that is commensurate with their duties that they're serving our children with every single day. And also their voice. Where in all of these policies as we move forward, where is the teacher voice? In the data section, in the data bucket, you know, we talked about, or you asked me specifically about retention. We currently do not have a statewide exit survey, nor do we have a working condition survey. And so in their report, part of their 16 recommendations was to move forward with that and build out, we've been watching Katie and her work, build out the workforce data dashboard. And with that report and those recommendations, we know that that will help move and shift the barriers that we have. Also messaging and branding. There is nothing that breaks my heart more when I hear an educator say, I would not have my children go into the profession. And you know, why do they have that feeling? What is going on? What are those barriers that need to be removed? Talked about salary and compensation, benefits as well, healthcare, top of mind with many of our educators of one of the reasons why they're choosing to leave the field. And then also too, for Nevada, the strategic use of the funds that we have, and then also increasing our funding. One thing I didn't mention in my introduction is I did spend almost 4 years in New York as the Senior Deputy Commissioner for P20 Education. So I spent time in a state that is #1 in funding education and the educational environment for children. And for those of you that are familiar, Nevada, depending on which metric they're using, is either 48, 49, or 50 in funding education. So there's a lot of work within our context that we need to do, but based on bringing our teachers together, also higher education was, they were brought in, as well as the presentation to the legislature most recently in June on all of these recommendations. We're going to move forward. We're also one of the few states that our legislature meets every other year. And so session begins in 2023. And our strategy is to work with our legislature to pick up on these concepts that our educators have moved forward and move it forward into the next generation of work that we have ahead of us.
Got it. One editorial comment, just appreciate, trying to get teacher voice on, what's happening, working conditions, exit. But for me, it's mind boggling that in 2022, we're not already asking those questions. Like, how do we begin to fix stuff if we're not listening to folks? So appreciate you moving forward.
Right.
Hate that wasn't done before you got there, but appreciate the leadership. Katie, same question. If you could only do one thing, strengthen recruitment or strengthen retention, where would you spend your time and energy, and what would you do?
So pointing back to one of the things that Joan mentioned about the exit survey and the working conditions survey, that's one thing right off the bat that we need to do better in Indiana. And again, that teacher voice. So just lifting that up as well. Arne, you asked an aggressive question, and I'm pretty aggressive myself. So I'm going to aggressively tell you, like, we can't not do both. And our data says that very, very clearly. When I talked about the squeeze, and I'm looking at this data chart showing our longitudinal data, and it's going like this, right? So we have more teachers exiting, we have fewer teachers entering, and therefore we have a problem on both. And we have to, I think the biggest takeaway I'd share is we can't keep operating in the same way we have for the past decades in how we're doing each of these. We're going to have to be innovative, really think outside of the box, really get uncomfortable on how we're making sure we're doing both. And I promise that's not a political answer. That is
That's real.
answer, Arne.
All I want is your truth. That's your truth. I appreciate it. And I
Yes.
do think, again, the supply demand data is so critically important, and is often, again, been this total mismatch of who's coming into the profession, what are the skills, what are the majors. And so just starting to have, to your point, transparency and honesty around this is not a short-term fix, but long-term, I think is hugely important. Final question I'll ask each of you, and then turn over to Jeremy, because I know we have a lot of questions from the audience. I want to give them time to weigh in. It is a challenging time. It's also a time, summer, getting ready to go back. What gives you guys the most hope going into the new school year?
Joan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so since I was just in classrooms on Monday, the energy, we are laser focused and continue to listen not only to teacher voice, very important, but to our children. Like, what is it that our children want to be able to do as they grow through the entire system? And that's a shift that we're moving. Kind of had a conversation about competencies for licensure and education in the teacher workforce. But we in Nevada actually are moving toward the entire state, moving toward competency-based learning for our students as well. And so that they have authentic engagement as they move forward. They're solving problems, real world problems that they are engaged in, and move forward at their pace, and that we're meeting them where they are at in their work. But to welcome the children on Monday was so uplifting. And the parents that, you know, in the elementary school, when you see they're there, especially with the kindergartens right up against the fence, you know, making sure that they get into the classroom. Parent involvement right now is huge. We know the conversations about education and how in some instances, just, you know, tribal in nature and not moving forward in a productive way. But in Nevada, having those conversations, bringing everyone to the table, bringing our children to the table with the educators as we move forward is critical. And that's how we're going to get the work done, by bringing everybody collaboratively around to move forward. We are moving toward the moon in reinventing how education is. And we are, I love you, Katie, but we're going to be the leaders in this area as we move out of where we've been.
Hope you guys tie for first. So Katie, what gives you the most hope as we go into the new school year?
So what immediately popped in my mind is when we have talked to our teachers, and as we've really heard from them, they've talked about one thing that would really contribute to retention is if you just let us teach. Like, just let us teach, get some of the bureaucracy out of the way, let us focus in. So one of the things we're really leaning in on in Indiana is contemplating, we do believe it's very important to understand where our children are in reading, in STEM, right, in some of these areas. And yet we also know there's a real importance in valuing other indicators that matter for a child. And other indicators could be measuring skill development. Other indicators could be credentials of value being completed at that high school level for the teacher who's a dual credit teacher, right? And there are a variety of other indicators that we're building out. But that's something that's generated a lot of excitement in Indiana, a lot of energy, and contemplating again, schools are incredibly valuable, the most valuable asset to a community. And it's time that we as a country really rethink how we're measuring schools and children. And I know I'm talking to a past Secretary of Education, so I'm expecting like a rebuttal, a back and forth. But I think we've learned a lot since then. We've learned a lot since you were in your leadership position, and now's the time that we really have to innovate and make sure our students have access to a variety of learning rather than just sit and get.
couldn't agree more. And we could talk all day, but I actually want to turn this to Jeremy and get our audience in. But obviously what we didn't talk about much on this call, on this Zoom, is the social emotional piece of this. And that's always been critical, but it's obviously more important than ever, and how we not just measure that, but how do we make sure we're taking care of our kids, their parents, our teachers. Obviously an absolute premium there. But yeah, before I close this, thank you both for your hard work, your leadership, your vision, your passion comes through on this. And anything I can do to help, I'd love to do that. Jeremy, I'll turn it to you, and let's open up to our audience and hear from them.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to Secretary Jenner and to Superintendent Ebert, and thank you to former U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, who is now a managing partner at Chicago CRED, which stands for Create Real Economic Destiny. And so we have a host of questions that have come in from the audience, and we're going to try to tackle some of these. A few of these have already been answered to some degree by our panelists. And so the first question I'm going to throw out is from Rosalind Payne. And so, what can be done to increase the compensation for teachers? And what do states need to do to really fully fund teacher candidates with both tuition and living expenses if they're in that candidacy?
So I'll dive in. One of the things we didn't get to was, talk about was the ARP ESSER dollars that were made available. Using data and information to the person asking the question, that money for the state of Nevada was so invaluable because it gave us the opportunity at the state level to look at where and why there were non-completers in higher education, right? They weren't even making it that last mile. And so we invested $20.7 million to incentivize pathways in teaching. And what that was is paying our pre-service educators while they were doing their teaching. So up to $8,400 to go through their last 3 semesters. They, in education, we've asked them to do the pre-service during the day. They have jobs. I talked about that earlier, right? People need to earn an income while they are doing their pre-service work. And so we have put that money aside. We'll be moving forward with the legislature to make that permanent. And we'd also like to see that happen at the federal level. We know that in other professions that does transpire. And so we have been working very closely not only with the funds that we have, but looking into the future on how we can make sure that people are compensated properly as they're going to become an educator.
Well, I would just chime in to that. I have right beside me, it's interesting, my teacher, I won't read through this, don't worry, my teacher compensation binder that is very noted and posted lots of on what we've implemented from that commission in Indiana that was right before COVID, what we've implemented, what we still need to move on. The General Assembly did provide a $600 million increase 2 sessions ago to specifically, last budget session, to specifically increase teacher pay. But the other thing I want to go back to is I think we have to acknowledge the supply and demand. We have to acknowledge that, again, in Indiana, I can tell you, I need 451 special education teachers, right? I need X number of science teachers, math teachers. Unless we start to acknowledge the supply demand and how the marketplace works and how we must pay, our science teachers are going to continue to be drawn to the biotech company right down the road, to the statistics company right down the road. It is happening on repeat. And I think that we're seeking to learn a lot from what that marketplace shows us. And then maybe again, how we might lean in on significantly increasing our teacher pay. We also have a pilot, I'll say a career ladders pilot in Indiana that we're watching closely, about 20 of our school corporations. And the career ladders, of course, is designed to really keep your high quality teachers, not only in your schools, but also supporting and serving other teachers so that they're not immediately drawn to administration or immediately recruited to another industry. So that data, where I have it right here, we're still studying that, and the districts have a couple more years of implementation, but that's going to be an important one for us to watch as well, because I wholeheartedly believe we should provide significant increases for teachers who are very, very laser focused on the quality of instruction and learning happening in their buildings.
That's great. We had a question which I want to gloss over real quick, really dealing with how do you fund and implement teacher residencies and those opportunities, because we covered that in April with Penny Schwinn, and I'd urge you to look at our website and go back to that. But there is a good question, and it's from a representative from Latinos for Education on, what are you doing specifically to recruit, nurture, and retain educators of color who are underrepresented at many of the levels of education?
So very similar but different to what Katie had shared in starting in high schools. We started a program actually prior to the pandemic, teaching and training program. We actually had a superintendent that wanted to teach the course as well. But growing our own here in Nevada, our population actually looks like, and is projected, it looks today like the rest of the United States will look in 2060. So we have a very diverse population, and that starts with our children. And so our Grow Your Own program starts in freshman year. In high school, we have currently about 8,000 students that are taking either level 1, 2, 3, or 4. It is a CTE program. I think we missed the boat prior to not having it labeled as a career and technical education program. And so that was a shift that we made at the department working with teachers. We have 36 programs across our state that are moving forward in this way. It is the most diverse group of young people that I have ever seen. We're working with our higher education institutions as well to make sure that they continue out of high school into, when they finish the program in high school, they are ready to become a paraprofessional in our schools. And so they can continue that work as they go on directly through higher education as they become a teacher. So the diversity starts in our own classrooms with the diverse population that we have. Really excited, and the students are just amazing. Again, it's great to visit schools where the students were actually alumni of the high school. The high school that I was in on Monday had half a dozen teachers that actually graduated from that high school. They were all teachers of color, are invested in the community, want to be there, see themselves well into the future staying within that community.
So another really excellent and important question. I hit on this a little bit earlier, but I would just invite participants to Google this, or we can send it in follow-up information. Our Ivy Tech Community College partnership with Marian University, really targeting the effort to recruit more Black and Hispanic teachers into our classrooms. That's one. The other one I mentioned earlier is, again, it's administered by our partner agency, the Commission for Higher Ed in Indiana, but it's our Indiana Teacher Residency Grant program. It was established in 2019. So it's early in looking at that longitudinal data, but we are starting to see positive results on that. So I'd encourage you to take a look there, and could elaborate further on some other things as well.
So we've probably got time for one more question. So I want to throw out a little bit of a question that Scott Sheehan had thrown into the Q&A part. What are you seeing needs to be done to change the perception about having an actual career in education? I think this is a really important one. I think Arne spoke about it a little bit. How do you plan if people are only staying for 6 to 8 years instead of for 30 years? This morning, my wife and I's middle daughter started her student teaching. She's been in a teacher prep program, so we're very excited. But the perception that she even has from some of her friends saying, you're going into teaching, is very interesting to watch. So how are you as a state leader combating that or working to change that perception?
This profession is none like any other. The joy that you receive from when that light bulb goes off, and especially being a mathematics educator, right? I still remember the Barbie doll that was said, you know, I hate math. So I'm in a profession, especially being a woman, that there's always been this negative thing about mathematics, but it's having people that inviting early and often the public into our classrooms. It's not just a one-time event, but it's lifting all of us up together. I completely honored, and Katie met her in 2021. Nevada had our first National Teacher of the Year, and I know that Juliana presented at the conference as well, Juliana Urtubey. And you know, her platform was a just and joyous education. And the joy components, I don't think we can amplify enough. And for some reason, it got flipped during the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were people that, you know, their eyes wide open, because the classroom was a parent's living room, right? Their kitchen table, what the work of an educator is. And we need to make sure that we grab onto that, lift it up, and continue to invite our families back into the classroom to share the great work that is going on and how we lift and support their children.
So to piggyback off of Joan a bit, I'll share a few tactical examples that we're deploying on this topic in Indiana. First and foremost, some of our local districts have made the decision to use some of their ESSER dollars specifically for some of that teacher burnout. So it's almost like we're in this. We have the, you know, so that's one. But more specifically, I think as educators, and Joan mentioned this earlier, we have to do everything we can to recruit our own. Right? We are our best salespeople as teachers. And so one of the things that we've launched in Indiana is a series called Teachers Who Shaped Us. We interview the most known Hoosiers in Indiana, everyone ranging from Governor Holcomb to Olympian swimmer Lily King to we had Secretary Miguel Cardona as an honorary Hoosier do an interview, but all about like, tell us about the teachers who made a difference in your life. So we're doing a lot of that in terms of a statewide campaign there. Secondly, I'd say really listening to what our teachers need, and what we heard is they need their cup filled. And we heard on repeat about this group called Get Your Teach On, that our teachers had an interest in going to their professional development. It cost too much, or they didn't have access to it. So we did a statewide partnership with Get Your Teach On. And for 3 years, they're gonna have places all over Indiana, regional conferences for our teachers to go for free. That has been sold out. I've received more emails about Get Your Teach On. So with many of them saying, you gave us a burst of energy. This is what I needed, right? We gotta fill the cup. And then the third thing I'll mention is we had always had celebrations for our Teachers of the Year from different districts. This was an idea that came externally, like, hey, the tech industry has a gala. The education industry has, you know, rubber chicken in a conference room. Like, can we like step it up So we have, for the first time ever, an Educational Excellence Awards Gala. It's black tie optional. My husband is definitely not wearing black tie. He's wearing a dark suit. I'll tell you, he's already warned me. But it is to roll the red carpet out for our teachers and our administrators, really focused on the results that they are leading and producing. So that is coming up for the first time ever, September 9th. No more rubber chicken in Indiana for our people. We are stepping it up.
Well, that is great to hear. And I want to thank you all for the great questions from our audience. I know we didn't get to every one of them. If you have specific questions or policy questions, I'd urge you to contact us at Education Commission of the States, and we will work with you to try to get those answered. I also want to thank Secretary Jenner and Superintendent Ebert for sharing so much about what they're doing on this important issue. And a special thanks to former U.S. Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, for moderating. We really appreciate hearing about how these issues are affecting Nevada, Indiana, and states across our country.
This is the bread and butter of what we do, sharing learning across states. So we sincerely hope that you've gained something from today's discussion, something that inspires you in your work or sparks new ideas. To ensure we've hit the mark, we're going to drop a link to a survey, a very brief survey in the chat. Will also be available to you upon exiting the webinar. Thank you in advance for your feedback. We do use that feedback to inform webinars like these.
Thank you everyone for joining us today, and a big thanks to Teachers of Tomorrow for their support. We'll see you next time.